We dictate the terms, not them.
Hey Sopranos fans, welcome to another episode here on Bully Whispers, and while Jackie Jr. may have had the right idea regarding Law 8, his execution was terrible. He made a common mistake that Robert Greene warns of in confusing aggressive action with effective action. This is a mistake we see many characters make throughout the show, from Richie Aprile to Christopher with Adriana and Danielle.
What did you think? You were gonna fuck the two of us?
I watched it, and what happens next is up to you.
Now, while the actual wording of Law 8 is to make other people come to you and to use bait if necessary, when you actually read the chapter, there are too many situational exceptions for this to be a blanket statement. The essence of Law 8 is to get others to act on your terms, to keep the initiative, and there is no better character in the series to demonstrate the following and breaking of almost every aspect of the law than Tony Soprano himself. So in evaluating Law 8 through Tony Soprano, we will examine his bold moves and ability to keep the initiative, as well as several other key points, through his interactions with Jimmy Altieri, Big Pussy, Jr., Ralph Cifaretto, Johnny Sack, Tony B., Vito, Coco, and Butchie. A long list for sure, but Tony was a bold guy. One of the foundational premises of Law 8 is to master your emotions, to never let anger influence you. And while Tony has never been exactly the calm and composed type, he was more so earlier in the series. During the first season especially, even going into the second, Tony acted very much in accordance with Law 8 in a couple of ways. Since the actual wording of the law is to make other people come to you, we will start there, and since it further specifies to use bait if necessary, we will start with Jimmy Altieri before moving on to Big Pussy, Ralph Cifaretto, and Johnny Sack. With Jimmy, when they thought he was a snitch, they had Christopher lure him to his death using one of the oldest baits in the book.
Big tits, little feet, hitting any man's league.
Of course, Jimmy tried to call Chris out, but when he heard Sil behind him, he knew he was done. The bait had worked like a charm. However, Greene states that sometimes it's better to be overt, and this is what we see with Big Pussy.
What now?
Yeah, the owner's got two offers. I gotta decide this morning.
It's also important to note that both Jimmy and Pussy were hurried out the door, giving them no time to think, which is an important aspect of Law 8 that will come up again later. Now, at this point, you might be saying that in both of these cases, they went and got the person. They didn't get the person to come to them. But the thing to remember here is why they were wanted in the first place. They were thought to be snitches. So in those instances, they couldn't be allowed to show up on their own due to fear of wires. This is in contrast to Ralphie, who later provides a perfect example of when Greene says it's best to be overt, when you want to display power. Tony and Ralph were engaged in a battle of egos, and Tony essentially summoning him was impressive enough of a display of authority to humble the normally bombastic Ralph. In fact, having a say in dictating location is actually something that Tony remains consistently good at throughout the series, even when dealing with people over whom he has no authority.
Come into the city tonight, we'll sit down.
No offense, John, but I got an IQ of 136.
Of course, we have to give credit to Johnny Sack where credit is due. Even when he goes to New Jersey to meet with Tony, he still shows his authority by pulling one of the best low-key power moves in the whole show. Sitting on a toilet that for some reason has no walls or door, and making Tony listen to him while he takes a dump. The other area we see Tony act in accordance with Law 8 early in the series is in his dealings with Junior, and while the historical example given may not be a perfect parallel, the general principle still applies. During Napoleon's first exile, rather than trying to have him killed, which would have caused problems, Talleyrand instead inflated Napoleon's ego and facilitated his return, knowing it would lead to his downfall. He essentially just allowed Napoleon to get enough rope to hang himself, which is exactly what Tony was doing, letting Junior become boss. Knowing the FBI is always watching, they played to his ego and desires and got him willingly to step forward into the hangman's noose. Tony handled this early phase perfectly. According to Law 8, when time is on your side, let your enemy deplete themselves, which is what he was doing, putting Junior on top.
We all agreed to let Junior have his day. Let him be the lightning rod, and when lightning strikes, God forbid, and somebody goes down, it's not a young man with a family. You remember this? We all agreed.
However, also according to Law 8, when time is not on your side, you need to strike fast. And Tony realized time was no longer on his side after the failed attempt on his life. At this point, Tony engages in a series of bold moves, leaving Junior's crew no time to think or react, and gained unquestioned control of the family. Unfortunately for Tony, this is where the aspects of Law 8 that he doesn't follow start to catch up with him, and this is brought pretty specifically into focus during his first session back with Dr. Melfi.
I want to be in total control.
Tony never feels in control, And Robert Greene expresses that if you always find yourself chasing enemies here and there, but never feel in control, it's because your idea of power is wrong. You've mistaken aggressive action for effective action, and it's no surprise that Tony continues further down that path through the series, considering that's how he attained power. This increase in aggression, combined with a decrease in his ability to control his temper, would end up plaguing him throughout the rest of the series. Even in instances where it looks like he's operating within Law 8, a good case can be made that he wasn't, which brings us back to his chess match with Ralphie. An extension of the mandate to control your temper is to play on other people's tendency to overreact when angry, and Tony appears to do that with Ralph.
Your opponent is of choleric temper. Irritate him.
However, personally, I don't think this was quite the calculated strategy that Tony makes it out to be, and let me know if you disagree down in the comments, but I think that's just his personality. His natural inclination is to try and piss people off, especially those he's mad at, so I think that Tony would be acting this way no matter what, and he just found an ex post facto justification for it in Sun Tzu. Either way, starting with Ralph, the combination of Tony's temper and aggression really begin dragging him down. When his temper caused him to beat Ralph to death, we start to see the first real grumblings of dissent within the family.
I wouldn't piss on this Ralph if he was on fire. But to whack the guy over a horse, how fucked up is that?
Of course, we know now from the writers that Tracy was more of a factor than Pyomai, but that wouldn't have made a difference to the guys since most of them either didn't care or barely remembered. From here, we will focus on 3 bold moves by Tony regarding Tony B, Vito, and Coco, before moving on to the position Tony finds himself at the end and how predictable it was according to Law 8. His handling of the Tony B situation was not only bold, but also the least justifiable of the 3. Despite Tony saying he would see about Tony B getting made, he was never actually made, and he killed 2 very well-connected made men in a much more powerful New York family. So in that sense, Tony's refusal to hand over his cousin was audacious to say the least. However, in killing Tony B himself, he managed to be the one dictating the terms of this dispute, eventually getting out of it because Johnny Sack is a pragmatist, and because it's easier to get forgiveness than it is to get permission. Unfortunately for Tony, Johnny Sack's time at the top was cut short, and after a bit of shenanigans in New York, the guy who ends up on top is the one guy who wasn't satisfied with the outcome of the Tony B situation, Phil Leotardo. To make matters worse, Phil also had a personal interest in what would be Tony's next bold move, not giving up Vito. Now, depending on who you're listening to, Tony may have had a leg to stand on here. Despite there being a rule against being gay, when listening to guys such as Sammy the Bull, this is the sort of thing that is taken care of within the family. They're the ones who are supposed to investigate, and if true, they're the ones who are supposed to take action, so Tony wasn't entirely in the wrong in turning Phil down. That being said, it was still a bold move on Tony's part because New York was far more powerful, and Phil hated him already at that point. Unlike with Tony B, with the Vito situation, New York maintained the initiative, eventually killing Vito, and though that issue was over, tensions remained high. The last of the 3 bold moves, his beating up of Coco, was easily the most justifiable of the 3. It is well known that families are off limits, and especially when dealing with Tony's daughter, a strong response is to be expected.
Look, when it comes to daughters, all bets are off.
However, where Tony really ran into problems is when he pointed his gun at Butchie. While Butch never really viewed Tony as an equal, and even looked down his nose at him a bit, this one act turned him from someone who just didn't really think highly of Tony into someone who actively hated him, which brings us to where Tony finds himself at the end of the series. According to Robert Greene, oftentimes aggressive leaders engage in a series of bold moves and gain power, only to end up exhausting themselves going in many directions, reacting to the threats posed by their many enemies, which is pretty much where Tony finds himself by the end. At this point, even though Phil is gone, Butchie, who now hates Tony, is in control and in prime position to say, "We gave you our boss, you give us yours." To make matters worse, 2 of the main guys that Tony has left, Paulie and Patsy, both have reasons to dislike him and want him gone. While there are plenty of theories regarding both, which I won't get into on this episode, with Paulie the combination of his superstitions about taking over the Cifaretto crew and his fear of Tony after the boat incident certainly don't leave Tony in the highest regards. Of course, with Patsy, we've known for a long time he wanted Tony dead, ever since he had Patsy's twin brother killed in another one of his bold moves during his rise to power. Ultimately, Tony's temper and aggressive style backed him into a fairly predictable corner, although it's important to note that despite this, he was able to go quite far due to the fact that he was quite adept at keeping the initiative. Well, thanks for watching another episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.